Hi again, and welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about Hobbes's Leviathan, chapter 14, and I want to raise the question about the formation of his political community. I want to raise the question about what grounds this. Like, where does this come from? It's really the question of obligation that, as I read this, comes to my mind, and I want to see if you think the same way as I do about this. So starting with chapter 14, what I'd like to do is just backtrack a bit and go to chapter 13, where he ends up on page 71 in this book. He says, "To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust." So he has this notion of injustice or justice. He says also in the very same line, the notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place. So right, wrong, good, evil, justice, injustice in the state of nature, which is the state of war, of one against all. This is human beings in the woods just trying to survive before there's any political or governmental authority. These terms, right and wrong, good and evil, have no place. They have no relevance. They don't refer. So where do they finally have a place? And if you jump ahead to chapter 15, you see in the second paragraph, he says that when a covenant is made, to break it is unjust. The definition of injustice is no other than not performing covenant, or your part of the contract. Whatsoever is not unjust is just. And so it seems like it just on the face of it that these terms, these moral terms, only exist once you have the social contract in place. And he says that earlier on in the book as well. There's the notion of what he just means by good and evil in the state of nature is appetite or aversion, meaning what we want to do is good, and what we want to avoid, that's bad. Those we're trying to avoid the bad things. We call those things evil. And so those terms in the state of nature only mean those things. But we'll see in just a minute that it's not clear that those categories are just like I've painted them here, or what it seems like on the surface Hobbes is saying. So let's go to 14, and right off the bat, in the first paragraph, he gives us the definition of a right of nature. So a right of nature for him is the liberty each man has to use his own power as he sees fit for the preservation of his own nature. And so this sense of right here is a liberty. Now, don't think of liberty in the deeper philosophical sense. What I mean is, don't think of liberty in the discussion of free will. Remember, we were talking about Descartes earlier, and for Descartes, freedom or free will has to do, well, it's metaphysical, right? And even I criticize Descartes for having a very impoverished view of freedom. Nevertheless, what we have here is something less philosophical and more just political, right? It's the absence of external coercion or external constraints. So you are free as long as you can do what you want to do, and nobody's stopping you. And what does a right mean in this context? If you jump ahead to page 73, top of page 73, Hobbes says every man has a right to everything, even to another's body. So if one person wants to kill someone else, they have a right to do that. I don't know if that sounds strange to you, but it sounds strange to me, because when we talk about rights today, if I have a right to life and I have a right to protect myself, what that means is a corresponding obligation on the part of others not to try to take my life, right? So rights in this context seem to mean something different than rights today, and that's probably just because the language of rights has evolved over the centuries. So that's probably the explanation of that. So we have the notion of a right, we have the idea of liberty, and then in the third paragraph in chapter 14, he says, "A law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive to his life, or takes away the means of preserving it, and to omit that by which he thinks may be best preserved." So the law, he defines it in the very next line. He says, rights are consistent in the liberty to do or not to, or to forbear. The law determines and binds to one of them. So when we talk about obligations, what we're talking about, it seems like we're talking about laws. We're not talking about rights. And so for these laws, where do these laws come from? Well, next paragraph. Consequently, it is a precept or general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it. And from this rule of reason, Hobbes draws two branches. First, he says that we'll call the law of nature, fundamental law of nature, is to seek peace and follow it. And second, it's the right of nature to defend oneself. So he gets this from reason, the general rule of reason. And then from this law of nature, he goes on and finds a second law here in the next paragraph, that a man be willing when others are too, as far as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down his rights to all things and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. And so here you have the beginnings of the social contract, where human beings decide for the sake of survival, for the sake of flourishing, they want to not be at war all the time in the state of war. They will lay down some of their rights in exchange for other people laying down their rights on them, on their lives, in order to live peacefully. And so you see in the following pages some of the details of that, how the contracts are initiated with words or without words, and what limits there are to these contracts. Namely, the agreements can never be such that it demands you to harm yourself or take your own life. An interesting point is raised on page 76 that I want to consider. He says in the first complete paragraph on 76, in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war of every man against every man, if a covenant is made in which neither of the parties performs immediately but trust one another, it is void. But if there is a common power set over them both with right and force sufficient to compel performance, it is not void. So these words, when he says void, it makes me think that the contract is null and void, right? It has no value. It no longer is effective. But it's not clear that makes sense with what he said earlier. So he's trying to say that in the state of nature, when you've got a covenant and you've got no coercive power to ensure that the contract is fulfilled by both parties, then, well, it's not enforceable, right? And so it seems like that's what he's saying here. In fact, that's what this commentator, Alan Ryan, says about these passages. He says, Hobbes held two views that are in tension but not at odds. Covenants always oblige in foro interno, which just means inside you. You have an internal obligation, which is to say that we must be willing to do what we have promised if it is safe to do so. But Hobbes never says that in the state of nature, the laws of nature do not oblige. He claims that they do not always oblige in foro externo, which means publicly. There may not be any public obligation to do it. So to understand what's going on here, I think we need to see that when he uses the terms obligation or oblige, he can use them in two different senses, right? We might have an obligation to follow the laws of nature even when we're in the state of nature, right? Even when there's nobody threatening us with punishment, we do have an obligation to follow the laws of nature, and that is to seek peace and to enter into a contractual agreement, a covenant with other people. We have that. Although those covenants may not be enforceable, right? We may not have an external or public obligation to carry those out or carry out our side of the bargain. We do have an internal obligation. So then the question, I think, naturally arises, where does that obligation come from? And so here, I think, is a place where we can start to make sense of all the theistic language going on throughout parts 1 and 2, and ultimately in 3 and 4, that God is interwoven throughout this book. He keeps on referring to God and God's place in the universe, God's place in the social contract. It seems like here, this notion of reason can be, I'm not saying it necessarily has to be, understood in terms of a theistic worldview, that there is something called the natural law, which finds itself in God's creation, the way that God structured or ordered the world, We find it even in our own natures. So when we reflect on the universe, when we reflect on nature and our natures carefully, we come to this conclusion that we have an obligation to follow these certain precepts. And these, he calls them laws. And what is a law? When, especially a moral law, if you have no lawgiver. This opinion of mine, and that I've come to after reading some of these commentaries on it too, is also reinforced by the footnote at the end of page 88, which is the end of chapter 15, where the editor here comments that there seems to be both a theistic basis for the laws of nature and a non-theistic basis. Perhaps Hobbes is trying to write to a general audience. He's trying to make an argument that's convincing to religious and non-religious people alike. And so if you look for the theistic basis, you can find it in here. If you're looking for a non-theistic basis, it also is present here. So perhaps that's what Hobbes is doing, but this might help you also wrestle or come to a conclusion about whether he's successful in establishing the political community or the move out of the state of nature into society. So I'll leave that to you to decide, and I'll see you next time.